Do we have free will as humans? That depends on how we define it. A lot of arguments for free will are pretty abstract. Others come from religious traditions, which is fine, but in the debate between free will and determinism often looks more logical and consistent. It's hard to argue against determinism because the universe does look deterministic in many ways. Every cause has an effect, and effects depend on prior causes. That's how physics works, how we launch rockets, how we land probes on other planets. At the macro scale, determinism explains things beautifully. But this video is about free will, and I don't think anyone seriously believes inanimate objects have the same kind of freedom as we do. The question is, are minds just another deterministic machine, or do they work differently? Determinists usually argue that our conscious willpower, agency, and decision-making are afterthoughts, just stories told after the subconscious has already acted. If I say, I'm gonna go to the store and buy a soda, maybe that's really just my subconscious craving sugar, while my conscious mind builds a neat explanation. Now, I'll concede, many of our thoughts start subconsciously before we are aware of them. But what I don't concede is that all of our decisions work that way. This is where contingency comes in. Philosophers use contingency to mean dependence on prior causes, but I'm using it in a second sense. Things don't have to be the way that they are. They could be otherwise. Determinists claim every state of the universe is fixed by its initial conditions. Now, I admit much of the universe probably works like that, but when it comes to the human mind, things are more complicated. Take a simple example, deciding what to drink. Subconsciously, I crave soda. It tastes good, it's bubbly, and I associate it with pleasure. But then I remember soda is unhealthy, so I consider buying coffee, or maybe I consider brewing tea at home to save some money. Suddenly, I have competing options. My conscious reflection enters the scene and interacts with my subconscious impulse. It's not just one domino falling into the next. It's a back and forth process. A determinist might respond that this entire weighing of options is still happening subconsciously, with consciousness only watching from the sidelines. But notice, conscious reflection does feed back into the process. When we consider consequences, we sometimes go against our first impulse. That interplay is what I mean by contingency. Now, determinism is unfalsifiable as a whole theory. You can't test the claim that everything in reality must unfold one way and no other. We can predict physical systems with Newtonian mechanics, yes, but we also know that not all physical systems behave like billiard balls. Quantum mechanics, for example, is probabilistic. We built an entirely new branch of physics precisely because classical determinism could not explain it. And by analogy, the mind doesn't behave like a purely classical system. It's not predictable in the same neat way. And even determinists will admit that it still feels like we make decisions, that we could have done otherwise. Now let's consider a thought experiment. Suppose we lived in a perfectly deterministic universe and we had a future predicting machine. I'm craving soda, considering coffee, and thinking about tea. Now, the machine predicts that I'll choose tea. But now I know that prediction, and in knowing it, I can rebel. I can decide to drink tap water just to contradict it. What this shows is that no prediction about a self-aware mind can be both public knowledge and absolute certain. Because when we know the future, that knowledge changes the causal chain itself. the future becomes contingent. And this brings me to a second point. Not everyone has the same measure of free will at all times. Children are more impulsive. Some people struggle with self-control or lack education. Awareness, maturity, and knowledge all increase our capacity for reflection, and therefore our measure of free will. Language acquisition itself rewires the brain, and education shapes how we think. The more perspectives we can bring into play, the more options our minds can weigh. Douglas Hofstadter calls the mind a strange loop. That is to say, it is a system in which unconscious processes shape consciousness. That consciousness then in turn shapes the unconscious processes, which then shape consciousness again. He calls this downward causality, and I agree with him in a sense that self-awareness interacts with subconscious, but where I differ is that I think this loop creates real contingency. In his book, I Am a Strange Loop, he frames this as an argument against free will, but it's really an argument in opposition to the position that free will is necessary in so much as it arises from a dualistic framework, where mind and body both exist simultaneously and yet separately within reality. But that's not what I'm arguing. I'm still arguing from the perspective of a non-dualistic universe, and that these strange loops create contingency, which then allows for free will. Now, desire is often used as a determinist's gotcha moment. That is to say, we always just follow our strongest desire. But desires compete within the mind. Soda brings pleasure. Tea brings health and thrift. Water brings rebellion against the prediction machine. And which one of these wins? And this is where identity comes in. So, addiction taught me something. When I vaped nicotine, it wasn't just a craving, it became part of my identity. Quitting wasn't simply waiting for a new desire to overpower the other one. It took years of reflection, self-awareness, and willpower to cultivate the desire to quit, until my identity shifted from I'm someone who vapes to I'm someone who doesn't need nicotine. That's the point. Self-awareness lets us reorder our desires. Identity becomes the lever that reshapes which desires dominate. The mind then recognizes its own contingency, its own ability to change, and in that recognition, free will emerges. At this point, it's important to note that identity itself is contingent. Think of it as a blank canvas. A canvas can take on any number of paintings, and each brushstroke reshapes what's possible next. The self works in a similar way. Our sense of who we are, our identity, is not fixed. It can be revised, repainted, and restructured. And because identity redirects which desires we endorse and which we reject, that contingency extends into our choices and behaviors. So, when identity recognizes its own openness, its own blank canvas quality, the chain of causality that would otherwise lock us into a single course of action is loosened. Desire no longer dictates identity. Identity dictates which desires are allowed to define the self. So, with all this in mind, let me present a few premises, followed by a conclusion. Premise 1. Determinism, understood as the claim that every event is necessitated by prior causes, is unfalsifiable in principle. It cannot be empirically verified that all possible events must occur in only one way. Premise 2. While macro-scale physical systems operate deterministically, the human mind is not merely a classical system. Its operations involve complex feedback between conscious and subconscious processes which resist straightforward prediction. Premise 3. Self-aware agents can condition their behavior on information about themselves, including predictions of their future. This reflexivity introduces logical instability into the deterministic forecasting, rendering absolute predictions of their actions impossible. Premise 4. Free will is not uniform, but exists in degrees, varying with self-awareness, education, and the ability to reflect. These factors expand the range of genuine live alternatives available to the agent. Premise 5. Identity itself is contingent. Because the self can reconfigure which desires dominate through reflection and practice, the strongest desire at any moment does not irrevocably determine action. Identity's capacity for self-revision creates an open field of possible outcomes. Therefore, free will exists as the contingent capacity of self-aware agents to select among genuine alternatives by reconfiguring their identities and desires within, but not reducible to, the broader causal structure of the universe. So, while determinism explains much of the world around us, it doesn't close the book on the human mind. We live in a space where awareness, reflection, and identity give us real choices, where our futures are not painted in advance, but reshaped by the strokes we choose to make. Whether you call this contingency, agency, or simply free will, it is the power we hold to become more than what our past alone would dictate. And maybe the most important question isn't whether free will exists, it's what we choose to do with it. If this gave you something to think about, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear where you land on free will versus determinism. And if you enjoyed this kind of deep dive, hit the like button so more people can join in the conversation. Of course, don't forget to subscribe if you want to keep exploring philosophy, consciousness, and all the mysteries that shape our lives. Thank you for watching or listening, and I'll see you next time.